At 0630 on March 1, 1943, Major Ed Larner stood on the rain-slicked coral runway at Port Moresby, watching his B-25 Mitchell crews ready themselves for a mission headquarters had already deemed impossible. He was 31, had flown 72 combat missions, and so far his squadron had sunk 0 ships. The Japanese had sent out a large convoy from Robalo, 8 troop transports escorted by 8 destroyers carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers bound to reinforce the garrison at Lae. American intelligence had picked up the convoy's departure. Every transport that reached Lae would mean another division the Allies would be forced to uproot from dense jungle at great cost in blood. Larner faced a plain tactical problem. Bombing from 10,000 feet gave enemy ships too much time to escape. Japanese captains watched Allied bombers climb to altitude, predicted the bombs' trajectories, and steered their ships away from the impact areas. For 8 months, 5th Air Force crews had tried to hit Japanese convoys and had averaged a miserable 3% success rate. Most of the bombs detonated in empty ocean while the ships steamed on. The math was cruel. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from altitude took 37 seconds to strike the water. In those 37 seconds, a destroyer steaming at 30 knots could cover 380 yards, more than 3 football fields. Bombardiers aimed at where the ship was, and bombs struck where the ship had been. Larner had watched this scene repeat mission after mission. Aircraft returned with perfect bombing photos showing tight shot patterns circling the vessels but not hitting them. Crews reported direct hits that later proved to be near misses. The Japanese kept sailing. American bomber losses kept mounting. In the previous month, his squadron had lost 4 aircraft, 40 men, trying to stop convoys. Japanese gunners picked off high-altitude attackers with steady, methodical accuracy. From high altitude, they had time to track the incoming planes, calculate the lead, and bracket formations with flak. By the time the bombs fell, half the attacking squadron might be on fire. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, had proposed something that sounded insane to every pilot who heard it. Skip the bomb across the water like a flat stone. Fly in at 50 feet. Release the bomb about 300 yards out with a 5-second delay fuse, let its momentum carry it into the enemy hull. The bomb might bounce once or twice and then detonate on contact or just beneath the waterline. The theorists insisted it would work. The pilots called it suicide. Flying a twin-engine bomber at 50 feet over ocean swells straight toward a ship bristling with anti-aircraft guns violated every survival instinct Larner and his men had. Japanese destroyers carried 127mm main guns, 25mm autocannons, and dozens of smaller weapons, all capable of tracking an aircraft at that altitude. One solid hit to an engine and a B-25 would cartwheel into the sea before the crew had time to react. Higher command had banned the tactic twice already as too dangerous, too experimental, and unproven. Larner's requests to practice skip bombing had been refused in December and again in January. Official replies called the idea reckless and a disregard for men and materiel. Aircrews were told to stick to established high-altitude methods. But high-altitude tactics weren't sinking ships. If you want to see how Larner's skip bombing experiment turned out, please hit the like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Pacific War. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Larner. He went into the operations tent and spread reconnaissance photos across the planning table. The convoy had been sighted at dawn, steaming southeast through the Bismarck Sea. 8 heavy transports in 2 columns with destroyers screening the flanks, every vessel crammed with troops, artillery, and ammunition. If those transports reached Lae, the New Guinea campaign could drag on for another year. Larner had an idea that would either prove Kenny's faith in low-level attacks right or get 60 American air crews killed before lunch. The convoy would pass within striking distance at 0900, 3 hours to prepare, 3 hours to teach his pilots to fly in a way they never had before. He summoned his squadron leaders to the tent and explained the plan they'd been forbidden to practice. The B-25 Mitchell wasn't designed for what he was asking. It had been built for medium-altitude, level bombing. Its twin Wright Cyclone engines could push it to 300 miles per hour in level flight, but that speed meant little if Japanese gunners had 30 seconds to acquire and fire on the approach. Kenny's modifications changed everything. Mechanics from the 5th Air Force had ripped out the bombardier's position in the nose and mounted 8 50-caliber machine guns forward, 4 in the nose and 4 inside blister mounts on the fuselage. The B-25 was transformed into a flying gun platform capable of putting 200 rounds per second into a target. The concept was straightforward. Suppress the ship's anti-aircraft guns with concentrated forward machine gun fire during the run-in. Force the gunners to duck, to choose between firing and surviving. Larner had watched the mechanics bolt the guns onto his aircraft 3 weeks ago. The conversion added 1,200 pounds and shifted the bomber's center of gravity forward.
The modifications transformed his bomber into something halfway between an attack aircraft and a specialized maritime strike fighter, a type of plane that had never existed before. The practice missions had been carried out in total secrecy. Kenny had located a wrecked ship named the Pruth, a 4,700-ton steamer that had run aground on Nader Reef near Port Moresby back in 1924. The rusted hull sat partially underwater, an ideal target. Larner's crews practiced their runs at first and last light, when visibility was poor and there were fewer eyes to notice. They learned to skim just above the surface at 270 miles per hour. They learned exactly when to release their bombs. And they learned what happened when one tiny error ruined everything. Lieutenant Jake Fawcett made that mistake on February 16. He approached too high, about 70 feet instead of 50. The bomb skipped twice, soared completely over the Pruth, and detonated 300 yards past the hulk. Fawcett's bombardier, Sergeant Mike Russo, reworked the calculations. Lower, faster, release closer to the target. On the very next attempt, Fawcett came in at just 45 feet. The bomb bounced once and smashed into the Pruth's side just below the waterline. Exactly where a warship's magazine would sit. Precisely where a single bomb could trigger 1,000 tons of ammunition and rip a destroyer apart. But the Pruth wasn't firing back. Larner now placed the reconnaissance photos on the briefing table and pointed to the convoy's lead transport, 800 feet long, around 10,000 tons, capable of carrying 1,500 men, the flagship. Every officer in the tent understood the stakes. Japanese reinforcements had turned Buna into a 6-month bloodbath that cost the Allies 5,000 casualties. If these transports reached Lae, the fight would be even worse. The numbers behind skip bombing demanded a level of precision most bomber crews had never trained for. Approach at just 50 feet above the ocean, hold 270 miles per hour, release the bomb exactly 300 yards from the target, keep the bomb's trajectory at an 8-degree angle, use a 5-second delay fuse. Get anything wrong and the bomb might leap over the ship, explode too early, or plunge into the sea at the wrong angle and simply disappear. Larner assigned each pilot a specific transport, 1 through 8. If their assigned target was already burning, destroyers became the secondary objective. No plane would attack the same ship twice. The plan demanded speed and maximum devastation. 1 pass, 1 bomb, 1 chance. At 0700, the crews headed out to their aircraft, 54 men in 9 B-25s. Supporting them would be 13 Beaufighters from the Royal Australian Air Force, tasked with the first strafing run to suppress anti-aircraft fire. High above, 16 B-17 flying fortresses would drop bombs from altitude, forcing the Japanese ships to swerve and breaking their formations apart. P-38 Lightnings would keep Japanese Zeros occupied up high, but the decisive strike would come from Lerner's 9 B-25s flying at wave-skimming height. Lerner climbed aboard at 0715. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Benz, was already deep in the pre-flight checks. Bombardier Staff Sergeant Carl Walls checked the release system for the 4th time. Silence filled the aircraft. This crew had flown together for 9 months. They understood what a 50-foot run against destroyers meant. They understood the odds. Lerner started the left engine, then the right. The Cyclones roared to life. Across the field, 8 more Mitchells were powering up. They would launch in groups of 3. Lerner's element would lead. Stay low the entire route. Japanese radar couldn't detect planes below 100 feet. Surprise was their lone advantage. At 0745, Lerner released the brakes and the aircraft surged forward. By 0930, he would know whether Kenny's theory would sink a fleet or whether he had taken his entire squadron to their deaths. The flight to the Bismarck Sea lasted 90 minutes. Lerner held his formation at just 30 feet above the surface, so low that seawater spray sometimes splashed the cockpit glass. The 9 B-25s flew in a loose V, each spaced 200 yards apart. Close enough to keep eyes on each other, far enough apart that one shell couldn't destroy multiple planes. No radio chatter. The Japanese listened to every frequency. A single call could alert the convoy. Stealth mattered more than coordination. Lerner checked his watch, 0830. The convoy should be about 60 miles northeast, moving at 12 knots towards the Vietaz Strait. The ocean appeared empty. No ships, no wakes, no signs of life, just endless blue. At this altitude, Lerner could barely see 5 miles out. The convoy could be anywhere. Their navigation had to be flawless. Stray 5 degrees off course and they'd miss entirely. Approach from the wrong direction and destroyers would have time to swing their guns around and fire. At 0852, Lerner spotted dark smoke smearing the horizon, diesel exhaust from 16 ships pushing through the sea. He pressed his throat mic once, a single click. His wingmen replied with single clicks of their own, radio discipline intact. The convoy sharpened into view, 2 parallel columns of transports, 4 ships in each, destroyers forming a protective barrier 2 miles ahead and along both sides. Lerner studied the nearest destroyer, 6 main gun turrets, dozens of rapid-fire mounts. Every one would turn towards him the moment his planes crested the horizon. At 0857, the Beaufighters made their attack. From 3 miles back, Lerner watched 13 Australian aircraft dive out of the northeast. Their 20mm cannons raked the decks of the destroyers, tracer-round streak low over the sea. The Japanese anti-aircraft guns immediately shifted toward the new attackers, exactly what the plan demanded. The Beaufighters weren't there to sink anything. Their job was to make every gunner look in the wrong direction at the critical moment. Half a minute later, the B-17s appeared at 10,000 feet. Liners saw their bomb bay bores open, and strings of bombs began falling toward the convoy. The Japanese ships twisted violently to port and starboard, attempting to dodge. Their formation dissolved. Spacing widened. Destroyers surged ahead at maximum speed, leaving foaming wakes behind them. Confusion spread, precisely what the Americans needed. Liner eased back his throttles and dropped to 40 feet. His airspeed bled down to 260 miles per hour. Staff Sergeant Walls called out the distance, 4,000 yards, 3,800, 3,600. Each ship was now sharply defined in the morning light. Liner chose his target, the second transport on the port side, 700 feet long, heavily loaded, sitting low in the water. A hit amidships would tear through compartment after compartment packed with troops. Suddenly, the destroyer guarding the left flank spotted them. Liner saw the flashes from its guns as it opened fire. The first salvo passed high. The Japanese were used to engaging high-flying bombers. They hadn't yet adapted to this terrifying low-level rush. At 2,000 yards, Liner squeezed the triggers. All 8 .50 caliber guns roared at once.
Red tracers stitched across the transport's superstructure, shattering windows and sparking off steel. Japanese sailors dropped flat or dove for shelter. The suppressive fire was working. It was impossible to aim while heavy rounds ripped through gun positions at more than 800 per minute. At 1,200 yards, Larner could see his wingmen spreading out, each bomber aligning on its designated ship. The formation broke apart, intentionally. 9 bombers attacking 9 ships at the same moment, leaving defenders no time to concentrate fire or react properly. At 800 yards, the destroyer fired again, and this time the shells straddled Larner's aircraft, blasts on both sides. A shockwave slammed into the B-25 and fragments clanged against the fuselage. Benz, the co-pilot, shouted that the port engine's oil pressure was falling, still barely within safe range. 600 yards. The transport now consumed the windscreen. Larner could see individual figures on deck, soldiers sprinting for cover, gun crews swinging weapons toward him. Every instinct begged him to climb, to escape the steel cliff hurtling toward them at a combined closing speed of almost 300 miles per hour. But he held steady. 400 yards. Wals's voice cracked sharply through the engines, bomb armed and ready. 300 yards. Larner hit the release switch. The Mitchell lurched upward as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free, tumbling, momentum-driven. It struck the water nose first, skipped high like a skipping stone, then shot straight toward the transport's hull. Larner yanked back on the yoke, pulling into a steep climb. Behind them, the 5-second fuse counted down. The explosion hit right at the waterline. Larner didn't see it, his eyes were on the sky, but he felt the concussion slam the bomber, pitching the tail up and nearly rolling them over. Benz, the co-pilot, wrestled the controls as the altimeter swept past 100 feet, then 200, then 300. Larner risked a look back. The transport was ripping apart. A tower of flame and black smoke blasted up from the center of the ship. The hull twisted, metal shrieking as fires tore through the decks. The ship leaned left, water pouring into the massive breach. Soldiers hurled themselves over the rails, dozens, maybe hundreds, tiny specks spilling into the sea. One bomb, 15 seconds from release to catastrophe. Skip bombing worked. To the right, Lieutenant Jake Fawcett pulled up from his own strike. Another transport was burning fiercely, flames licking up its forward mast. On the left, Captain Bill Hayes had targeted a destroyer. His bomb bounced twice and smashed below the aft turret. The stern heaved out of the water in a monstrous blast, and when it fell back, the rear third of the warship was simply gone. The destroyer began sinking stern first, fast. 4 hits in a minute and a half. The Japanese formation was in total disarray, but they were recovering fast. A destroyer on the far side turned directly toward the attackers. Its main battery fired rapidly, shells stepping closer and closer toward Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25. The first splash landed 50 yards off, the second missed by 20. The third hit. The bomber blew apart instantly, the payload detonating beneath it. One flash, then nothing. No parachutes, no crew. 5 men gone before anyone could even register the loss. Larner saw fragments scatter across the waves, but had no time to dwell. The attack continued. The remaining B-25s pressed on. Lieutenant Carl Johnson bore down on the lead transport, the flagship. His approach was flawless. 50 feet, 270 NPH, guns blazing. Every Japanese weapon fired back. 20mm, heavy machine guns, even rifles. The air a storm of tracers. Johnson released perfectly. The bomb skidded once and punched deep into the hull just forward of the bridge before the fuse triggered. 3 decks blew apart in an instant. Fire churned up from the cargo holds, and Larner knew exactly what was stored there: fuel, ammunition, artillery shells. The ship became a floating furnace. Men burned alive on deck, then leapt flaming into the sea. Lieutenant Warren's bomber was hit as he lined up on his target. A Japanese gunner had finally learned the trick of shooting at low-level bombers. 20mm rounds shredded through Warren's left wing.
Fuel streamed wildly, but he held his path. 300 yards, 200 yards, at 150 yards, he released. The bomb ricocheted off the surface and smashed through the side of another transport. Warren turned sharply away, trailing flames, while his co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Miller, triggered the fire suppression. The blaze sputtered out. The bombers shuddered, but stayed airborne. 6 transports were now in flames or sinking, 2 destroyers crippled, 1 B-25 lost. The initial attack had taken just 4 minutes, and a second wave was already coming in. 9 more B-25s from the 90th Bomb Squadron, led by Major Ralph Cheel. They had watched liners run from 5 miles away. They knew the new tactic worked, and they understood the deadly price.
Cheel's squadron fanned out, every bomber finding a ship that was still afloat. But this time, the Japanese were no longer caught off guard. Every weapon they had was angled low. The destroyers formed a barrier, their main batteries firing in synchronized bursts. Columns of water shot skyward all around the incoming aircraft. The defensive fire was overwhelming, precise, deadly, and informed by the mistakes of the first wave. If the Americans wanted to strike again, they would pay for it. Cheel's B-25 attacked from the east, directly out of the rising sun. A smart move. Japanese gunners could barely see him, squinting into the blinding light. His bomb struck a transport already low in the water. The blast finished it. The ship rolled over and sank in under 2 minutes, dragging approximately 1,200 troops with it into the sea. Lieutenant Harold Jensen was not as fortunate. His approach was incorrect, too flat, too quick. His bomb bounced across the waves 3 times, sailed completely past the destroyer he intended to hit, and blew up harmlessly beyond the convoy. He pulled up, determined to try again. But the destroyer he had missed tracked every second of his turn. When he lined up for a second attempt, the warship was waiting. The first shell tore away his left engine. The second smashed into the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 flipped over and slammed into the ocean at full speed. No fireball, no floating wreckage, just violent impact and then nothing. The sea swallowed the aircraft as if it had never existed. 2 B-25s were now gone. 7 transports were either ablaze or sinking. 3 destroyers were badly hit. The entire battle had lasted only 8 minutes so far, and Larner understood with a cold shock that roughly 60 Zero fighters had yet to appear. They came screaming down at 09:15, 18 of them diving from 12,000 feet. Larner spotted their silhouettes dropping through fractured cloud cover, predatory and fast. The P-38s should have intercepted them. Something had clearly gone wrong. Perhaps the Lightnings were overwhelmed, or a second Japanese fighter group had joined unseen. Larner's B-25 was now a fragile target, fuel running low, ammunition nearly gone. The nose guns had maybe 200 rounds left, not nearly enough for a dogfight or to hold off skilled Japanese pilots who had learned the hard way that American bombers could punch back. He shoved the throttles forward and dropped even lower, 20 feet, 15, propellers chewing up spray from the wave tops. The Zero formation split. Half stayed high to battle the P-38s, while 9 peeled off toward the bombers. They attacked fast, over 400 miles per hour, firing 20mm shells from 1,000 yards away. Larner watched green tracers whip past his cockpit. Too close. He bobbed left and right, trying to spoil their aim. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake fired from the dorsal turret in short, disciplined bursts, forcing 1 Zero to abandon its pass. Not destroyed, simply wary. Warren's damaged bomber didn't escape so easily. A determined Zero stuck on his tail, matching every turn and climb. Warren pulled every evasive move he knew, overstressing the damaged wing. The Zero pilot waited patiently until Warren bled off speed in a climb, then fired a quick burst. Warren's starboard engine erupted in flames. The plane dipped forward and plunged into the ocean at full speed. Larner saw 3 parachutes open. 3 lives out of 5. Better than nothing. The Japanese fighters continued their attack for 6 long minutes, then abruptly broke off and climbed away. The reason became clear. The B-17s were returning for another bombing run at 10,000 feet. The Zero pilots had to decide,
chase the low-flying attackers, or protect the remaining ships. They chose the latter. The heavy bombers posed the bigger threat now. Larner used the pause to evaluate their condition. The port engine ran rough, oil pressure unstable, fuel down to 60%, possibly enough to get home. He looked back. 8 transports hit, 7 either going under or already gone. The 8th still burning but attempting to limp toward New Britain. Among the destroyers, every one had taken hits, 2 dead in the water, the others scrambling to rescue survivors. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was far from finished. It was only 09:21. The opening strike had taken 11 minutes, but the destruction would continue for 3 days. American bombers would return every 6 hours. PT boats would hunt lifeboats. Japan had sent 7,000 troops into that convoy. Barely 1,200 would ever reach Leh. The rest would drown, burn, or perish from exposure under the tropical sun. Larner headed for base. The squadron was scattered across 30 miles of ocean. 4 planes confirmed missing, 20 men killed or unaccounted for. But the mission had succeeded. Skip bombing had proven itself brutally and undeniably effective. The tactic would soon be refined, standardized, and taught throughout the Pacific Air Forces. Within half a year, Japanese commanders would be forced to give up moving large convoys anywhere Allied aircraft could reach. Supply routes would choke, the war's momentum would shift. But Larner didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was his fuel was dwindling, one engine was on the verge of failing, and home was still an hour and a half away. He ordered every non-essential item thrown out: spare guns, leftover ammunition, tools, equipment, anything to lighten the aircraft. The B-25 struggled to hold altitude with only one engine producing useful power. At last, Ben spotted coastline ahead. New Guinea's south shore, just barely on course. The port engine shuddered violently now, oil pressure leaking from a widening crack, temperature edging into danger. 5 more minutes and it would seize. Larner feathered the propeller and transferred every bit of power to the right engine. Airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour, right at the edge of stall, but still flying. Closer, 40 miles, 30, 20. The engine survived. Larner brought the aircraft down at Port Moresby at 11:17. The runway was crowded. Ground crews, mechanics, intelligence officers waiting anxiously. Word had already spread that the convoy had been hit hard. No one yet knew just how devastating the blow had been.
Chell's formation fanned out, each bomber picking a target from the remaining ships. This time, the Japanese were prepared. Every gun along the convoy was trained low. The destroyers had formed a defensive line, and their main batteries fired in coordinated salvos. The ocean around the attackers erupted with shell splashes. The barrage was fierce, deliberate, and lethal. The Japanese had learned from the first strike and intended to make the Americans pay for returning. Chell approached from the east, straight into the sun, a clever tactic that left enemy gunners half-blinded and firing at ghosts. His bomb struck a transport already listing. The blast sped its sinking. The ship rolled over and slid beneath the waves in less than 2 minutes, taking roughly 1,200 troops with it. Lieutenant Harold Jensen wasn't so fortunate. His approach angle was wrong, too shallow and too fast, and his bomb skipped 3 times, cleared the destroyer completely, and exploded well past the convoy. He pulled up to circle for another run, but the destroyer he'd missed tracked him throughout the turn. On his second pass, its guns found him. The first shell tore away his port engine, the second smashed the cockpit, and Jensen's B-25 flipped and crashed into the sea at full speed. There was no great fireball, just impact and then a quiet that swallowed the aircraft. With 2 bombers lost, 7 transports burning or sinking, and 3 destroyers badly damaged, the fight had already lasted 8 minutes when Larner realized that nearly 60 Zero fighters were still aloft somewhere above the cloud layer. At zero line 15, 18 Zeros dove from 12,000 feet, silver shapes tumbling down toward the American formation like hawks on prey. The P-38 Lightnings were supposed to be intercepting the attackers, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps the Lightnings were outnumbered, or an unseen second fighter group had joined the fray. Liner's B-25 was especially vulnerable. Low on fuel, dangerously low on ammunition. His forward guns with barely 200 rounds left, not enough for a prolonged aerial duel against experienced Zero pilots. He shoved the throttles forward and dropped to wave-top height, 20 feet, 15. Salt spray whipped at the propellers. The Zeros split into two groups. Half stayed high to tie up the P-38s, while half peeled off to hunt the low-flying bombers. They came in fast, at some 400 miles per hour, firing 20-millimeter cannons from about 1,000 yards. Tracer fire cracked past Liner's canopy, too close. He jinked left and right, making himself a difficult target. Behind him, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake manned the dorsal turret and fired short, disciplined bursts at the nearest Zero. One Japanese fighter broke off, not destroyed, merely wary. Lieutenant Paul Warren's already damaged bomber was not so lucky. A Zero latched on his tail and would not be shaken. Warren tried every evasive move he knew, climbs, dives, hard banking turns that strained the damaged wing, but the Zero pilot waited with chilling patience until Warren stalled in a climbing turn, then fired a 2-second burst. Warren's starboard engine blew apart. The bomber plunged into the ocean. Liner watched 3 parachutes open. 3 survivors out of 5. The Zeros pressed their attacks for 6 brutal minutes before suddenly breaking off and climbing away. Liner soon saw why. The B-17s were returning for another high-altitude bombing run. The Zero pilots had to choose between continuing to chase the low attackers or protecting the convoy from the larger, higher threat. They chose to guard the ships. Liner used the respite to take stock. The port engine was running rough, oil pressure fluctuating, fuel down to about 60%, possibly enough to reach Port Moresby, maybe. He looked back. 8 transports had been hit, 7 were burning or sinking, the 8th was aflame but still making for New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screen had taken damage, 2 dead in the water, the others circling the burning transports, trying to pick up survivors. The battle for the Bismarck Sea was far from over. It was 0921. The opening strike had lasted 11 minutes, but the slaughter continued over the next 3 days. American bombers returned roughly every 6 hours. PT boats hunted lifeboats and picked off survivors. The Japanese had loaded 7,000 troops onto the convoy. Fewer than about 1,200 ever reached shore at New Britain. The rest drowned, burned, or died from exposure. Liner set course for base. His formation was scattered over 30 miles of ocean. 4 bombers were confirmed lost, 20 men dead or missing. But the mission had succeeded. Skip bombing had proven itself in the most brutal, undeniable way. The technique would be honed, standardized, and taught to bomber crews across the Pacific. Within 6 months, Japanese commanders would stop moving large convoys within range of Allied land-based air power. Their supply lines to forward garrisons would be choked off, and the tide of war would shift. Liner didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that his gauges were falling, one engine was failing, and Port Moresby lay 90 minutes away. He ordered the crew to jettison everything non-essential: spare guns, unused ammunition, tools and parts, anything to lighten the aircraft. The B-25 struggled to hold altitude on one engine. At last Ben sighted land, the south coast of New Guinea. They were barely on course. The port engine was shaking, oil streaming from a crack, temperatures climbing into the red. 5 more minutes, and it would seize. Liner feathered the port prop and put all power onto the starboard engine. Airspeed fell to 180 miles per hour, just above stall, but the bomber stayed airborne. The coast drew closer, 40, 30, 20. The engine held. Liner touched down at Port Moresby at 11:17. Ground crews, mechanics, and intelligence officers waited along the runway. Word had already spread that the convoy had been struck hard. No one yet knew the full scale of the disaster. Liner switched off the engines and sat in the cockpit for 30 seconds, and still on the controls. Beside him, his co-pilot was similarly still. Neither man moved. They had been flying for 3 hours and 43 minutes, but it felt like 3 days. The debrief would last 2 hours, with intelligence officers asking the same questions in multiple ways. How many ships hit? How many sunk? How many bombs dropped? How many aircraft lost? Fragments formed a picture. 9 pilots had attacked, 5 returned. Mitchell was gone, Jensen gone, Warren in the water but rescued by a Catalina flying boat, 2 men wounded. Reconnaissance photos arrived at 1300. An Australian bowfighter had photographed the scene from 15,000 feet at noon, and the images told the story Liner's crews could not fully see. 8 transports, 7 confirmed sunk or sinking, the 8th beached on New Britain and aflame. 4 destroyers, 2 sunk, 2 badly damaged and withdrawing towards Rabaul. Total elapsed time from the first strike to the last collapse, 3 hours. General Kenny arrived at Port Moresby at 1600, walked straight to the operations tent, and spread the reconnaissance photos across the table. He did not congratulate anyone or shake hands. He pointed at the burning beached transport and barked, "Finish it." The Australian bowfighters were ordered to make another attack at dusk. Nothing could be allowed to reach Lae. The second strike launched at 17:30. Liner did not fly. His bomber needed a fresh engine. But he stood on the runway and watched 9 new B-25s lift off into the setting sun, bound for the target at dusk. The Japanese survivors would be gathering what they could from the beach to move inland. They would not expect another attack. They were wrong. The strike returned at 2000. The beached transport was gone, sunk at its moorings. The 2 damaged destroyers caught trying to withdraw were struck again and sank. The Japanese had begun the operation with 16 ships. By nightfall on March 2nd, 14 lay on the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The remaining 2 destroyers limped into Rabaul at midnight, barely afloat. The human cost was catastrophic. Some 7,000 Japanese soldiers had embarked at Rabaul. Reconnaissance over the next 2 days counted roughly 900 survivors reaching New Britain by lifeboat or swimming. American PT boats intercepted many lifeboats. Some survivors were rescued, others were killed in the water. Over those 3 days, the line between combat and massacre blurred. Orders were given for no quarter, and atrocities followed on both sides. Japanese crews had machine-gunned aircrew in the water and parachutes. American forces returned similar brutality against soldiers and lifeboats. Liner learned of these actions 3 days later. He did not ask for details and did not want to know which PT boat crews fired on lifeboats or which bomber crews strafed swimmers. The rules of war held until they didn't. They stopped applying somewhere between Mitchell's bomber shredding apart and the last transport foundering. No one wrote it into
The harbor held 18 Japanese warships. 30 of them were struck with direct hits. A heavy cruiser was sunk, a destroyer sent to the bottom, 2 support vessels destroyed, and 16 merchant ships left sinking or severely damaged. The entire attack was over in just 18 minutes. American losses amounted to only 2 B-25s. The balance had shifted back to the United States, but Rabaul also proved something crucial. Skip bombing was most devastating when enemy vessels had limited room to maneuver, harbors, straits, confined waterways. Against convoys in open seas, with space to turn and with fighter protection overhead, the tactic was risky. But against ships pinned at anchor, it was overwhelmingly effective. The British quickly adopted the method in late 1943.
Royal Air Force Beaufighters used skip bombing techniques against German coastal convoys off Norway, producing results nearly identical to those in the Pacific. High losses, but equally high success. The Germans responded by heavily reinforcing anti-aircraft defenses on merchant ships and ordering convoys to move only with substantial fighter cover. Shipping costs surged, effectiveness plummeted. The Soviets also applied skip bombing in the Black Sea and Baltic. Their approach was rougher. Extremely low attacks, heavier ordnance, much less suppressive fire. The outcomes were uneven. Some ships sunk, many bombers destroyed. Soviet crews had no shortage of bravery, but lacked the refined training and equipment the U.S. had developed through painful experience. By 1944, skip bombing had evolved into a multi-layered strike doctrine. High-altitude bombers would attack first to force evasive maneuvers. Fighters would swoop in to silence gun crews. Then, the low-level bombers made their runs while defenders were disorganized and ducking for cover. Losses dropped, effectiveness remained high. The numbers were undeniable. From March 1943 through August 1945, U.S. skip bombers sank or seriously damaged 212 Japanese ships at the cost of 47 bombers, a kill ratio of 4.5 ships per bomber. By comparison, high-altitude strikes managed only 0.3 ships per bomber. Skip bombing was 15 times more effective. But the human toll couldn't be measured so cleanly. Skip bombing demanded that crews charge head-on at ships covered in guns, flying straight while tracer fire clawed toward them. The psychological pressure was extreme. Pilots tasked with these missions rotated out sooner, suffered higher rates of combat fatigue, and were grounded more often for stress-related conditions. The tactic worked, and it broke the men who executed it. Larner never again flew a skip bombing mission after May 1943. Instead, he trained replacements, watched them launch in the same role he'd pioneered, and watched some never return. By war's end, he had trained 62 skip bombing pilots. 18 died in combat. 23 were wounded. A 29% fatality rate, 66% casualties when including the wounded. Better than high-altitude crews, worse than nearly any other job in aviation. Historians would ask for decades whether skip bombing shortened the war. The truth was complex. Skip bombing didn't win campaigns on its own, but it strangled Japanese logistics, drove convoy losses beyond sustainability, and forced the Imperial Navy to abandon mass troop movements. Without supplies, garrisons starved. Without fresh units, defensive lines collapsed. Island by island, Japan's perimeter crumbled. One fact was beyond debate. On March 2nd through 3rd, 1943, 9 B-25 bombers, flying at an altitude of 50 feet, annihilated an entire Japanese troop convoy in about 15 minutes of continuous attack. A tactic once forbidden, dismissed as suicidal, was vindicated by air crews who flew directly into torrents of gunfire because allowing 7,000 enemy soldiers to land was the far greater risk. The B-25s that fought in the Bismarck Sea were scrapped after the war, their aluminum melted back into anonymity, their histories carried only by the men who survived them.
None of the bombers from that battle survived into museum collections. Major Ed Larner returned to the U.S. in June 1943. He was only 31, yet he had flown 88 combat missions, far more than most Pacific bomber crews lived to complete. The Army Air Forces wanted him teaching new pilots, passing on his experience and the methods he'd helped make successful. He refused. Larner asked to move into transport aviation and got his request approved. For the rest of the war, he flew C-47s, hauling cargo and personnel across the Pacific. No more combat, no more skip bombing runs, no more watching men he trained die in airplanes he taught them to fly. He never explained the decision. He didn't have to. Command understood. Some men could return to combat after witnessing such loss, others couldn't. Neither choice carried shame. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in December 1943, declining twice before eventually accepting. It wasn't accolades he wanted. He wanted the war to finish and to go home. He got that in September 1945, when Japan surrendered. 3 months later, he left the service with a Distinguished Flying Cross, 2 Air Medals, and a Purple Heart from shrapnel wounds he never mentioned in reports. Larner passed away in 1997 in Sacramento at age 85. His obituary mentioned his military service briefly, but not the Bismarck Sea, not skip bombing, not the innovation that reshaped naval warfare. He had asked his family not to highlight it, and they honored his wishes. General George Kenney received much of the historical credit for skip bombing. That suited Larner fine. Kenney had proposed the concept. Larner had only demonstrated it. That distinction mattered to historians, not to the men who flew the missions. They remembered who had led the first run, who trained them, who devised the techniques that kept them alive while destroyers fired straight at them from 50 feet away. The B-25 Mitchell earned its fame in part because of skip bombing. It served everywhere in World War II, but its legend was sealed in the Pacific, flying missions no one believed survivable. By the end of the war, B-25s had destroyed more enemy ships than any bomber model in any theater. The method Larner's squadrons proved in March 1943 became standard for every B-25 group in the Pacific. No museum today preserves a B-25 that actually fought in the Bismarck Sea. Those aircraft were worn out by war's end and broken down for aluminum. A few Mitchells survive in displays, including restored examples in the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton and at the Smithsonian. They stand in for the ones that did. The battle itself is mostly forgotten outside serious military study. It doesn't carry the cultural weight of places like Midway or Guadalcanal. No famous photographs captured the moment. No Hollywood film dramatized it. What survives are reports, recon images, and memories from men who largely chose silence afterward. But this remains undeniable. In March 1943, American bomber crews showed that aircraft could destroy ships by skimming bombs across the sea at terrifyingly low altitude. People called the idea suicidal until it worked, and then it was labeled brilliance. In truth, it was a mix of necessity and ingenuity. It was men taking a gamble on an untested concept because the standard approach was failing. It was bravery measured in seconds, holding steady while anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. After the Bismarck Sea, the Pacific War changed. Japanese convoys stopped operating where Allied aircraft could reach them. With their supply arteries cut, troops starved, and island defenses collapsed. The fighting moved ever closer to Japan, one island at a time, while the Imperial Navy struggled to sustain its positions. Skip bombing didn't win the war alone, but it sealed off the supply routes Japan needed to keep fighting. If this story resonated with you, please help more people discover it. Hit the like button. That tells YouTube this is a story worth sharing. Subscribe and enable notifications. We bring forgotten history back to life every day. And jump into the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Somewhere else? Our community spans the world. You're not only a viewer, you're someone helping preserve the legacy of these air crews. Let us know you're here. Let us know if anyone in your family served. Thank you for watching and for ensuring Ed Larner and his men are not lost to silence. They earned remembrance, and you're helping ensure they have it.